nonprofit performing arts center in Fayetteville. She has worked in the nonprofit sector for more than a decade, having held positions previously at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. As a grant professional, Kailyn has generated multi-millions in funding for the arts from foundations, corporations, and federal granting agencies. With that, I am delighted to introduce Kailyn Mason.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today. Nice to be inside instead of out in the heat. As Cassidy said, my name is Kailyn Mason. I'm the Director of Institutional Giving for Walton Art Center in Fayetteville. I've been in the nonprofit sector for more than a decade, but a grants professional specifically since 2015. And I've worked for grants exclusively in the arts sector. Prior to joining Walton Art Center, I managed the grant program at Crystal Bridges. I am very excited to be here today to talk to you about the exciting world of grant budgets. I know you all are just like tingling with adrenaline, but hopefully you'll get a lot of helpful information out of this. This is an introductory workshop, so what I'm going to try to do is give you a sense of what funders are looking for in grant proposals. We'll go over the basic components of a grant budget. We'll discuss terminology like what is a direct cost, what is in-kind support, that sort of thing. And then we'll talk about how to actually put together a grant budget that will complement the narrative proposal that you are submitting. So to just jump right in, the grant budget is a financial representation of your proposed activities for which you're requesting funding. It's not merely an attachment or a box to check, but rather a critical component of your proposal. Funders want to see in your budget the best estimate of what your project is going to cost and how you're going to pay for it. This means you will most often need to include not only expenses, but also your revenue. You'll see a note there that one size does not fit all. Budget requirements can vary from funder to funder, so some funders may have their own forms or structures that they want you to use with specific categories that they want you to put your expenses into. They might want to see emphasis on certain areas, and some may simply just ask you to submit a budget in your own format. So, like with narratives, it's the same with budgets. As much as we'd like to just create one project budget that we can submit with any and every grant that we might submit, you will most likely find yourself retooling your budget for every proposal that you submit. But regardless of format, what your funders want to see in your grant budget is your best estimate for what your project is going to cost. It's not just numbers, although it is just numbers. It's not just numbers. Those numbers help tell your story. It's the plan that you have for your project and your organization expressed in the language of dollars. The best budgets translate the words you use in your narrative into dollar amounts. So most grant reviewers are very savvy and will likely have a strong sense of what your cost should be. So for example, if I'm writing a grant for a funder that supports a lot of arts education programs, it's very likely that those reviewers will have seen enough proposals that they'll have a good sense of what a teaching artist might cost, what supplies for a certain number of people might cost. If you haven't done the due diligence to estimate reasonable costs, perhaps you under budgeted for that teaching artist or you over budgeted for supplies, they may very well interpret that you haven't prepared enough to carry out your project successfully. You don't want to risk that. And also, please be aware of vague language. In all of our organizations, we have terminology that is very specific to the organizations that we're a part of that may not be clear to those outside of your organization. For example, at Walton Art Center, we have something called local crew. Do you know what local crew is? If you do, raise your hand. I didn't either until I joined Walton Art Center. If I said that the same budget line in a grant, instead of local crew, if I put temporary employees, would that make more sense? Exactly. So that's the kind of thing that you need to think about when you're putting together your budget and describing your line items. What is clear to somebody who doesn't work with you on a day-to-day basis? I've participated in workshops where the presenters will go so far as to say that a reviewer should be able to look at your budget and your budget alone and have a strong sense of what your project is all about. That can seem overwhelming, but it is a good goal to reach toward. It may be why many grant reviewers go directly to the budget first before they even read what you put in your narrative. So today we're going to focus on two types of budgets, the organizational budget and the project budget. Our primary emphasis will be on project budgets, but it's important to discuss what an organizational budget is as well, because you will often be required to submit one along with your proposal. Sometimes it's just an attachment, And you might have to do that, probably will have to do that, regardless of whether your program is, or your request is for broad general operating support or for something very specific. The organizational budget is how a lot of funders will gauge, one of the tools that they'll use to gauge your kind of fiscal responsibility and health as an organization. So for the organizational budget, there's a little message here. I need to make it go away. Okay, sorry. For the organizational budget, it's just that. It's the budget for your organization as a whole. So you might be required to submit this, like I said, as a supplementary attachment for a project proposal. Funders might want to see an organizational budget to have a better understanding of the scope of your organization and how your project fits within that scope. For example, if you work for an organization that has an organizational budget, operating budget of $5 million, and you're requesting support for a project with expenses of several $100,000, your funder can understand that this program that you're requesting funding for is very integral to your organization. It might be a cornerstone project because you're willing to spend so much of your budget on this one program. Another reason that you might be asked to submit an organizational budget is if you're requesting general operating support. That is becoming more common in the grants world, that you have opportunities to request general operating support, which basically just means you can use the money how you need it. It's not restricted to something specific. If you are requesting general operating support, you would want to submit a whole budget for your organization as part of that request. Organizational budget should always include both expenses and revenue. So you'll show not only how your organization spends money, but where you get the money that you spend, whether that's earned revenue, like ticket sales, or through the sales of goods and services, or through contributed revenue, like donations, sponsorships, or grants. You want this budget to be comprehensive, but also as simple, clean, and easy to read as possible. And those sound like contradictory things, but I promise they're not. So looking at the next slide, this is an example of a section of a budget that you might receive from your finance team, where the lines are they're broken down to very small amounts. They are described in ways that are probably very internally comprehensible, but might not be so externally. And that's very important for internal purposes. You know, you want to know how you're going to spend every dollar. But to the external funder, it's a little bit too much information. It's distracting. It gets them in the weeds where they don't need to be. So you want to try to avoid just sending your blanket or all-encompassing organizational budget. So sometimes these budgets also include categories that even you as an employee of the organization have no idea what it means. Like, what's the difference between office miscellaneous and office supplies? Somebody knows that because they budgeted that way, but you as the grant professional might have no idea. So how is your funder going to have any better clarity? So what do we do about that? We simplify. You'll notice we went from however many lines here, 12 or so, to 5. So instead of specifying executive director versus temporary employees or contract labor, all of that just went into personnel cost. Condensed all of the rent and insurance, taxes, that sort of thing into one category. All of the accounting services were condensed into one category. Office supplies and miscellaneous were lumped together because they're all for the office into one category. And then there's a miscellaneous category where you can kind of lump things that maybe don't all kind of go together, but at least they're small enough costs that you can kind of lump them together. So dues, service charges, training opportunities, things like that. You'll notice that the totals on both pages are exactly the same. So we're not removing anything from the budget. We're just making broader categories and condensing line items to fit into those broader categories. So we have 134,000, 157 here, 134,000, 157 here. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about organizational budgets? This is something that whoever monitors the finances for your organization should have, and you can work with that person to kind of condense in a way that makes sense. Or they might, in our organization, we have two different versions of the budget, one that is broken down very specifically, and then one that is a little more, I don't even remember how they describe it. It's condensed. So it is helpful to have that on hand. And unlike the project budget, which you might have to tweak for every proposal, with the organizational budget, they're not going to require you to put it in a specific format. So you should be able to just do one simplified version once the budget is finalized and just have that to submit with any grant that you might submit. So that's helpful. Okay, moving on to project budgets, which really is the meat and potatoes of grant budgeting. These are much more limited in scope. So the project is whatever activities you're requesting grant funding to support. It may be a program, a marketing campaign, maybe you're hiring a new position, maybe you need to buy certain supplies or materials. The word project really can be encompassing of all of those things. But it is, the important thing is that it's limited in scope to what you are asking the funder to support. You must always include expenses, and most often you'll include revenue as well, but every once in a while you will come across a funder who just wants your expenses. Oddly, Walmart.org, Walmart Foundation, they don't ever ask us for revenue numbers. I don't know why. So that's one that you only really will provide your expenses, but it just kind of depends on what the funder wants to see. It's really important to read the application instructions carefully to know what you need to include. If it doesn't say specifically whether you have to or not, err on the side of caution, include those revenues, unless you're given a form that doesn't require you to input the revenue. It is very common for funders who have a grant form or a grant budget form that they ask you to use for them to create the categories for you. So you're in those circumstances required to make your line items fit into the categories that the funder created. This does happen a lot, and I frequently see the same kinds of categories when this happens. So those categories are typically personnel costs, travel, consultants or subgrants, as in money that you're going to get and then give to someone else to do something for the project. And then direct costs, which may be called implementation costs, and indirect costs. And we'll talk about all of those terms a little bit later, but what's important here is that you fit the expenses into the appropriate category that they are asking you to do to align with their expectations. So project budgets should always be tied directly to program design. That means that every cost that you include should be directly related to your project. It can be very tempting to kind of throw in expenses that are somewhat related, but not really. Don't do that. Keep it very specific to your project. Create that budget along with the program folks that are working with you to create the thing that will be implemented with the grant. Don't wait until the last minute or leave it to the finance office to do. It's very tempting to do that. I've fallen in that trap too many times myself, but it's best if you kind of build the budget and the program and the narrative simultaneously. Everything in your narrative must be reflected in your budget and vice versa. So if in your narrative you state that a program will have an activity where a classroom of children will make pop-up books about a play they saw at Walton Art Center. It's not a real project, but would be pretty cool. So maybe I'll talk to somebody about that. Just made that up today. You need to ensure that your budget reflects the supplies needed for that activity. Conversely, if you include in your budget that you're going to spend $2,000 on a marketing campaign and you want the funder to support that, you need to explain in the narrative what that marketing campaign is and what effect or impact you think it's going to have. So $2,000 on a marketing campaign for direct mail that'll reach 1,500 households and hopefully drive this much participation. Be sure to think of every possible cost. For example, what does it cost to add staff? What does it cost to add and operate a van if that's relevant? For example, I can tell you a mistake that I made recently. We recently wrote a grant for a new program at Walton Art Center called the Performing Artist Exchange that would allow us to send several dancers in the area to Los Angeles for this 2-week dance intensive workshop. which we were able to do. We got it funded. But we set the budget based on expected travel expenses. So what it would take to fly them there, lodge them there, a stipend for meals and incidentals, that sort of thing. We didn't put in the budget anything for the program that they were supposed to create when they come back. So that's unfortunate, but we will now be in a position where we need to ask for more funding or find that money somewhere else in the budget. So these things happen, but on the front end, and part of why that happened was we were creating this program the same week that the grant was due, so you know how it goes. We were very excited about the opportunity. We did the best we could, but anywho, we still got them there, and they're there right now, so it's all very exciting. So just, yeah, be sure to think through what are the possible costs that might come from this project and reflect them in your budget. Any questions so far? Yeah.
When you said on the other slide, I think it said like, include revenue or something like asking revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like going back to the operation or the organizational budget revenue? Like all the other revenue that you get for the whole organization, or just any revenue you get for that specific project already?
That's a great question. So for the project budget, it's going to be revenue that is specifically for that project. So for example, if you have a grant program or a program that you sell tickets to, and they could be $1 a piece, but you need to put that ticket revenue as part of the contributed revenue or the earned revenue on that line. You would also put, if somebody else has donated specifically to that program, you would put that revenue there. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but to balance your budget, what you often will have to do is put something called Applicant Cash. And that is kind of like where your broader organizational revenue goes to contribute across the board, where you would reflect that in your budget. But it is specific to the program that you're looking at when you include the revenue.
So, back to that very same question, if you are asking somebody for a portion of a project, would the project budget reflect the entire amount that the project was going to cost, and then it would just show the revenue coming in from other grant funding sources, or?
Yes. Now I think it would depend. You could take two different approaches. What I have always done is do the program budget as a whole, and the grant request amount as reflected as one part of the revenue. So for example, we have the Artisphere program. We submit a lot of grants for that. I do one Artisphere budget, that's the whole program, but we might only be asking for 10% of it from one funder. So that's outlined there, that this grant budget or this grant request is this much. We also have ticket revenue. We also have other supporters, and then applicant cash to kind of make up the balance. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions on this so far? Okay. All right, now let's jump into some key terms that you will often see with on grant budget templates, or that you'll see in the instructions of a grant application. Direct costs, indirect costs, revenue, contributed, earned, in kind. And then there's cost share versus match versus challenge. And then there's also the budget narrative and justification. So direct costs, these are going to be the clearest kind of project costs that are the costs that are associated specifically with your project, things that are bought or paid for that have a direct link to the activity. So if you're doing that art project in the schools where students create a pop-up book based on a play they saw, you need to buy, supplies for those pop-up books. Maybe you need to pay for a bus driver to drive them to the theater. You need to pay for the tickets to them to see the show, or maybe there's a book that they need to read along with it. Those could all be potential direct costs as part of that project. You can also include the salaries of the personnel working on the project. When you do include salaries, it's very important that you only include the amount of time that they're going to be spending on that project. So if you have an education coordinator who's going to be working on the pop-up book project, they're not going to, 100% of their salary should not be devoted to that project because they're going to be doing other things besides that project. Maybe that's 5% of their yearly salary is going to be spent working on this project. So you need to specify, estimate basically number of hours, take their hourly rate, and that's what you include in personnel costs. When you talk about supplies, you need to limit the supplies that will be used only on the project. This can be hard, and something that happened a lot when I was working at the museum. So at the museum, there are a lot of family programs, and they have supplies, markers, paper, glue sticks, all of these things. They have a big store of supplies that can be used in all of these different programs. But if you're only asking for support for I Heart Art, for example, you can't include all of the supply costs in that because not all of those supplies are going to be used for that one specific program. So the way that we did that at the museum was the education team estimated how much per person supplies cost. So for example, they had the amount that we expect to spend $1 per participant on supplies, regardless of what program it is. So then you can take your expected attendance, multiply that times that rate, and that's your estimated supply cost. It's very hard to be specific, very hard to get an exact estimate because you are just guessing, but it is your best educated guess. That's a reasonable assumption for you to make that with this many people come, we're going to use this amount of supplies. Does that make sense? And then anything you can clearly link to the cost of implementing the project. Marketing costs, if you need to hire temporary labor, we have security team costs that we have to include. If you need to rent anything or buy anything, anything that can be directly related to the project is a direct cost, and you want to maximize those for your grant because that's what they're going to fund. Most of what they want to fund are your direct costs. So make sure that you're thinking through anything that could be included there. On the other side of that is indirect costs, and these are a pain, but it's important that we reflect them because we have indirect costs, we have overhead. They're costs shared by all of the organization's programs, utilities, certain salaries for certain positions like the executive director, you have software licenses, insurance, all kinds of things. So this is just your overhead costs, things that you need but you can't assign to any specific program. Sometimes you can put these in your grant budgets and sometimes you can't. Sometimes a funder will say up to X% of program costs are allowed for indirect. So, if you have $100,000 in direct costs, maybe you can put 10% toward indirect and you can add $10,000 to your grant budget. For federal grants, I think you can do what's called an indirect cost rate negotiation where you work with some agency and they'll tell you what your indirect cost rate should be and you get a form and you can put that in all your grant applications. I haven't done that personally, so I can't speak to how that process works, but that is one way to get your indirect costs covered. Sometimes, frequently, funders don't actually allow that. So that's where reading those instructions is very important. Any other questions on costs before we move to revenue? Good? Okay. Okay, revenue, that's money in. Yes?
So if you were doing a small proposal that was project-based and wasn't attached to an existing organization, I mean, it sounds like it would probably be beneficial to maybe create a nonprofit to then be the organizational group to run the project. Mm-hmm. But like if you needed, for instance, a program, if it was a very limited scope organization that was created for the purpose of a specific project, then would it be fair to do more of the indirect costs, say, to be able to do this analysis, we need access to this program?
Yeah, I think if it's exclusively, if you have basically one project that you exist to do, I think that's completely reasonable. I will say, check all of the application requirements and make sure that you aren't required to be a 501c3 to apply, because that sometimes you can't apply for a grant unless you're an existing nonprofit organization. Just something to keep in mind. But yeah, if you can tie it directly to those activities, then it's perfectly reasonable to include it. On to revenue, so that's money coming in. There are different types of revenue. Contributed revenue is anything that's donated. Doesn't matter who it's donated by. If it's donated, it's contributed revenue. It could be an individual gift, a sponsorship, or the grant that you're applying for. Earned revenue is money that's generated by the activities. So if you sell tickets, if you sell t-shirts, if you sell food and drinks at your activity, that would go into earned revenue. In-kind revenue is the value of donated goods and services. So for example, for the pop-up book class, say that it's being led by a teaching artist, but that teaching artist is volunteering their time. That would be considered in-kind revenue. When you have in-kind revenue, what's really important to do is balance it with the expenses. So you have in-kind revenue, say that the teaching artist who would normally be paid $12 an hour, $15 an hour, is going to spend 6 hours on this project. That's in-kind revenue of however much amount that was. In the expenses, you would also include teaching artist cost that matches the same amount that you put in the revenue, so that those two things balance out. Does that make sense? I always find when I'm trying to explain in-kind revenue that I explain it in what seems like terrible ways. So if it's not clear, please tell me. Okay. Yeah.
I feel like I always get hung up on the balancing piece, like revenue sheet full expenses, but like in your proposal, you're asking for money for a specific project, so you don't have the revenue for that project yet. So should you include like the proposed revenue that you hope to get?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can just mark estimated or proposal submitted or, or a fundraising goal.
So it's always better to reflect it so that they balance rather than.
Yes, if you can, if you feel confident that you'll secure that money, it is perfectly reasonable to include that, and just with a little note that it's not yet secured or pending proposals. With federal grants, I don't know, has anybody ever tried to write a federal grant? I don't recommend it, but if you do, why did I even say that? Oh yeah, this is why. They make you ask for these things so far in advance of when you're going to be doing the project that it's very unlikely that you'll have secured any money for it yet. So all of that is going to be based on your fundraising goals or what you think you might secure. So it's not always going to be secured. And most of the time that's fine. The funder might say only include money that's already been secured. And if they do, you follow that guidance. But if they don't, it's perfectly fine to put estimated revenue. And that goes to this rule of thumb about balancing your budget. Sometimes the funder does not need to see that your budget balances. Basically, balancing your budget just means that your revenues equal your expenses, and that just shows that you're going to be able to pay for the thing that you say you're going to do. That can be really hard to do sometimes, so that's where that applicant cash that we talked about a little bit earlier comes in. Applicant cash meaning just money that you have in the bank that can be used across any program, that you can put that line in there to get your budgets to balance. Some funders will specifically say that your revenue needs to equal your expenses. Federal grants, if I recall correctly, almost always do. But not always. And I don't know what side of it, does it help to see how much money we need for this? To leave it unbalanced and see the huge deficit? I don't know. I sometimes I wonder if that would be helpful. See, we need so much money. Please give us as much as you can. But having that applicant cash section kind of solves that problem. And it shows that you're committed to doing the project regardless of how much income you get. Okay, cost share versus match versus challenge. Cost share and match are often used interchangeably just to mean the investment required by the grant applicant toward the project. What those basically mean is the amount of money that you have to commit against the grant that you're hopefully going to be awarded. It's determined by the grant maker. So for example, we submit grants to the Arkansas Arts Council, and they require a 1-to-1 cost share. That means for every dollar we get from Arkansas Arts Council, we have to match it, and that could include contributed funds, staff time, in-kind support, well, unless it says it can't include in-kind support, that sort of thing. The difference sometimes, I think, between cost share and match, or how they're used, is that cost share can be things like staff time, and match usually means you have to raise that money. It's actual cash that is contributed. Does that make sense? Like, so cost share could be dollars that already exist in your bank account. Match is like actual contributed revenue that somebody gave in addition to the grantor. I've seen a lot of different cost share requirements. NEH has a particular program that requires a 2-to-1 match. Challenge is a little different. Challenge means that you have to get new money contributed to support the program after your grant is already secured. And that's determined by the grant maker. NEH, again, has one that's like a capacity building grant that you have to match 4-to-1. So for every dollar that the NEH is going to give you, you have to make $4 from somebody new. The university, about 20 years ago, had a big, huge $1 billion matching grant. I don't know if anybody remembers that. It was a whole thing. My mom worked there, so that's probably why I'm so aware of it. But so yeah, it's a way, and a lot of the time you will hear a lot about a challenge grant because we're trying to generate interest to get people excited to say, oh, I want to help. I'm going to give you this money so that you can actually get that grant. Because a lot of the time with challenge grants, if you don't raise the money, you don't get the grant. So they might award you the grant and say, okay, I'll give you $100,000 if you get somebody else to give you $100,000. And if you don't do that within a certain time frame, your grant becomes null and void. They're often for big things like building buildings or, huge, expeditions. Any questions on that or any of these things? Okay. All right, budget narrative. This is often called the budget justification. So it could take many forms. It could be a separate document that you're required to submit based on a request from the grantor, or it could just be footnotes on your budget that help explain specific line items. It could explain anything that's potentially confusing or needs more clarity. It can explain how you got to the numbers that you got. When you do create a budget justification, it's important that it goes in the same order as your budget, so moving from the top to the bottom in order so that it's easy to kind of compare 1-to-1. You would also include your expenses. You might also include your revenue. You might describe how you'll get the match and explain other things, like if you have contributed revenue, who it's from. Here's an example here. Now this is a pretty long example, but it is a thorough one. So if you're including salary information in your grant budget, your budget narrative might say, the grant budget includes one FTE project coordinator paid for by the foundation with a fringe benefit rate of 15.68%. The applicant is providing as in-kind 10% of the CEO's time to supervise the project. The CEO's fringe benefits rate is 20.68%. The applicant is also providing the services of 0.3 FTE administrative assistant to do XYZ. And so all of those, this is basically explaining how you get to the number that's on your personnel or your salary line in your budget. Not all budget justifications or narratives need to be this thorough, but this is a pretty strong example of one. Does that make sense? All right, so now you know the terminology. Now what? Tips to get started. Use your lifelines. I know as a grant professional, it can often feel like we have to do all of the things. We have to create all of the information ourselves, but make use of the people who are very familiar with with the program. So the program staff, if you have a finance team or accounting team that you can go to for assistance there. Your HR team is also a helpful team to be have a good relationship with, because if you need to include salary information, you need to get that from the HR team. So those are all folks that you can go to get information to build your budgets. Start early. It's always a nice recommendation, right? Start early. It almost seems silly to say it. I have ADHD, so that's like a slap in the face. But I still will say it. It's like starting earlier doesn't help it. But anyway, that's always a good recommendation. Start early and develop before or alongside your narrative, not after. It's very important that your narrative and your budget work together to explain your project. So building them together helps make sure that you include, that both are reflective of each other. Steps in the grant budget process. This is adapted from this book that you can see at the bottom, Winning Grants Step by Step by Mim Carlson. I believe there's a later edition of the book with a co-author added that's available at the library. If you want to take a look, it's very helpful information. Breaks things down very clearly and succinctly. But steps in the grant budget process to follow. Establish your budget period. This would also be your grant period. So it's important to know what period of time your costs and your revenues are reflecting. So for some grants, you can ask for multiple years. So your budget will need to reflect multiple years worth of expenses. Yeah. Any questions about that? Establish your budget period. When are the funds going to be needed? Next, estimate expenses. So how might you do this? Has your program been offered before? If so, what were those expenses? Do you account for growth year over year? For example, our accounting team estimates 3% growth year over year for certain things. That might be a good estimate for you, or a good tool for you to use as you're trying to estimate future expenses. What new elements will be added and what old elements will be deleted. So for example, I used in the pop-up book example, I said perhaps we need to pay for tickets for the kids to go to the show. We don't actually charge ticket fees for our school field trip programs anymore, so that would need to be removed. That revenue would need to be removed, or the expense would need to be removed if there were costs associated with that in a budget that involved that program. Sometimes you might need to actually obtain cost estimates, like if you might use a consultant. You have to reach out to that consultant and see what they might cost, what they might charge. Yeah. Use all the tools in your arsenal. Decide whether and how to include indirect costs. So that will be dependent on if the funder will allow them or not. If they will allow them, they might provide very specific guidelines that say you can apply for up to 15% indirect costs. And there you go, just use 15%. And that's what you can use. Otherwise, you might need to You might need to work with your finance team to estimate what a good indirect cost rate might be. Estimate donated goods and services that might be used. So that's that in-kind revenue again. What might you be able to get donated that can offset some of your expenses? And try to estimate that. Because sometimes that is a good method. If you need supplies, if somebody can just donate those supplies instead of you having to buy them, that's a good thing that you can use it would be important to reflect in creating your budget. Estimate anticipated revenues. Often, similar to estimating the expenses, if you've hosted the program before, what kind of revenue has been generated by the program in the past? Or if you know that this might be of particular interest to a specific donor or a specific company, it might align with their giving values. Can you estimate what somebody might want to donate to support the program? Or do you have an overall fundraising goal that that you think is reasonable, and that can be part of your estimated or anticipated revenues? And ensure your budget as a whole makes sense and tells your story. I think I mentioned this before, but sometimes grant reviewers just want to look at your budget and get a sense of what you're going to do. Do you think that somebody could do that? Ask yourself that question when you're creating your budget. Do you think that it would tell your story and that it would make sense to an external person reviewing it? So here's the sources for your numbers again, the previous project budgets. what project staff might estimate something might cost, going to somebody for a price quote for something specific, and then just ask lots of questions. Lots of questions all the time. What about this? How do you know that it might be that? How many people do you expect it to serve? Et cetera, et cetera. Something that if you have travel in your budgets, a good source is the federal per diem tables at the gsa.gov site. It provides helpful information on what would be reasonable to spend on a hotel per night in a given location in a given month. So that's a really helpful tool to use when budgeting, whether it's for a grant budget or your own budget on, say, going to a conference. So you can look up what the per diem rate should be, and what hotels should cost. Here's that applicant funds again that we've talked about a little bit. They may fulfill required or suggested match. It doesn't necessarily have to be new cash. It can include just money that's in the bank or other grants or gifts if they're not restricted to something specific. And when you have a budget that requires a match, you can often use staff time. So for the Arkansas Arts Council grant that we submit every year to support our in-school residency, a big chunk of our match is the time spent by the coordinator of that program who, it's pretty much 75% of her year is spent on this program. And so that is a significant portion of our match for that grant. So we're paying her to do the program, which is why that counts as funds for the program. Any questions about that? And then just some budget gotchas to remember. Be aware of the maximum or minimum amounts that you're allowed to include in the budget. So if you have a budget that requires a one-to-one match, that means that you have to your project has to at least cost twice as much as what you're requesting. Does that make sense? So if you're asked for a $10,000 grant that has a one-to-one match requirement, your program needs to cost at least $20,000 because otherwise you won't be able to meet that match requirement. Check for your math and rounding errors. Excel, if it can have rounding challenges if you don't use the decimal, like past a decimal. The change, basically, it can round up and maybe it might skew your numbers a little bit, so just be aware of that. And not matching up with the project narrative. So if there's a line item in your budget, kind of like we mentioned before, if you have marketing expenses in your budget but you've never mentioned a marketing plan in your narrative, that's a hole that you need to kind of fill in your proposal. And then look for unallowable costs. Every grant RFP, request for proposal, is going to have a list of things that are not eligible for funding. Often includes things like food, parties, political donations, but just make sure that you're looking at that list of unallowable costs and not including anything in the budget, that you're at least anything that you're assigning to the funder. Okay, I feel like I raced through that, but it is 2:50, so any questions? Yes.
So the in-kind portion of these budget, how do you show that on a budget that you maybe in food or whatever donated?
You would just actually write as the line item in-kind donation of food from whatever the donor was, and then in expenses you would make sure that you have, say if it's for maybe like a meal is being supported, you're having a meal as part of an event and the restaurant is going to donate that food for the event. You would say food costs for event this much money, that same amount of money would be in the in-kind line in the revenue. So you would just make sure you mark it as in-kind donation of XYZ.
Any tips for when you're writing, like for a project that maybe is quite a bit more money than what the grant that you're going for, like maybe the grant you're going for is like a $10,000 but the actual project is like a lot more. Any tips on like how to like write for a grant that's smaller, knowing that the project is larger, but like picking out pieces?
That's basically what I do all the time. So it's very common to be in that situation. I think in those scenarios, the most important thing is making sure they know what specifically they're funding. So if you have $1 million project, but you're asking for $10,000, what can you call out of those expenses that the funder is specifically funding? Maybe they are funding the marketing costs associated with it and the supply fee, and you're just going to make sure that you're noting that either in your budget narrative or in your narrative, or maybe you're even highlighting it on the budget itself. So you're giving them the full scope of the project, but also explaining what specifically they are supporting. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think in those scenarios, what you could even do, you could just do the budget for those things that they are funding specifically. I don't think one is more preferable than the other. And that might be a good conversation to have with the program officer, whatever grant that you're looking at. Like, do you want, like for example, Artisphere that I brought up earlier, that's $1 million program. Do you want the full $1 million Artisphere budget, or do you want just the $100,000 that we're asking for? And they can give you that guidance. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Okay. Oh, I'm Kailyn. Here's my contact information. If you're interested, I can send this to Cassidy and she can shoot it out to all of you. Sorry I didn't bring printouts. Although, do people want printouts anymore? I don't know. Probably not, right? Okay. Well, thank you all.